want to introduce Ryan Cotten, who I believe you are the district organizer for California and the head of the CPI Rules Committee. Yes. And you are going to be giving us a presentation about the changing global order on the emerging alternative economy centered around Russia and China. So I want to thank you, Ryan. You came all the way from California, and you're going to give a great presentation. So thank you very much. All right.
Thank you, Caleb. Today I'll be talking about China, Russia, and the new emerging economy. So here's just an overview of some of the things we'll be discussing today. I'll first go through some economic data, and then we'll talk about some of the Marxist theory and theoretical contributions of socialism with Chinese characteristics. We'll talk about modern China, and then we'll end with some current news. The accumulated achievements of China since its revolution of 1949 are so great that every socialist in the world must define themselves in relation to China, whether in overall support or overall opposition. So you can think about the 20th century. Many socialists had to define themselves in relation to the Soviet Union. Today in the 21st century, the same is true for China. So here are the three prominent leaders of China that have contributed to Marxism in China. Mao Zedong, of course, who died in 1976, and then Deng Xiaoping took over, and then today we have Xi Jinping. And we'll be talking about each one of them throughout the presentation. So first, to understand the magnitude of China's impact, we need to understand their population and how significant this is. China accounts for 22.3% of the world population. That's 1/4 of humanity. And when we consider their growth, we need to consider the population. So, of course, China's had large growth. Some comparable growth has been in the Asian tiger countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. They've had great growth as well, but look at their population, only 1.4%. Soviet Union had a very large population of 8.4%, and they had pretty strong growth, 5.7%. But 22.3% is pretty big. The West had some growth too, kind of, but some of their growth was kind of propped up by the West through the Marshall Plan. So in 2014, a big shift happened, and China surpassed the U.S. in terms of purchasing power parity. So this is pretty important. China's taken the lead in the world economy today. So here, if we look at the average growth in GDP, we can see under the Mao period, 4.9% growth, which is pretty amazing. And since the reform and opening up in 1978, they've had this 9.8% growth annually in their GDP, which is just, it's almost unbelievable how large this is. Just to compare to the United States here, we've been decreasing our GDP growth over the past few decades. This is about 2.5% at the end. So there's a big difference going on here. So in terms of life expectancy, which is one of the key indicators of what's going on in the standard of living, despite the setbacks during the Mao period that we always hear about, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, they still had 31 years extended in their life expectancy. So, yeah, so over that 27-year period, people live in 31 years longer. That's over 1 year of life per year. Just to compare that to a similar country, India, which gained its independence around the same time as China, they only had 19 years. So there's something significant happening in China that we need to key in on. People are living twice as long. So it's not a surprise why people love Mao in China. This is kind of an interesting graph. So you can think about this graph. If it would have been 1-to-1, you would have seen a 45-degree angle. But it's not the case. And so what we're doing here is we're comparing GDP and life expectancy. So if it was 1-to-1, you would assume that GDP is 100% accountable for the increase in life expectancy, but it was about 71%, which means that 71% of the increase in life expectancy was due to rise in GDP. That means 29% is left over to account for the rise in the life expectancy. So there's other kind of quality of life changes that have happened in China that can't be accounted just by GDP. So we've heard a lot about the absolute poverty reduction in China. 853 million people. When you compare this to the poverty reduction in other countries, doesn't even compare. India, 166. That's the second place. So the magnitude of the poverty reduction is massive in China. And so their poverty reduction is not just simply due to it being a large country. And so what John Ross has done here is he's compared China to similar population groups. India has a large population, and then sub-Saharan Africa was kind of all lumped in, and that's the same population size. And if you compare the poverty reduction, India and Africa, nothing compared to China. Again, 853 million. So 3 out of 4 people worldwide have been lifted out of poverty due to China's changes. You can see some other socialist countries, Vietnam, Laos, have done a little bit, but China, 3/4 of the world poverty reduction. It's pretty amazing. So Mao Zedong, pretty influential. I mean, he founded the Communist Party of China. He helped set up the People's Republic of China. And some notable things that we're going to go into a little bit. The Sino-Soviet split happened in 1956, where China and the Soviet Union kind of took separate directions, and we'll get into that a little bit more. 1958 was a great leap forward, and then the Cultural Revolution in 1966, towards the end of his life. And so the Cultural Revolution we need to talk about. Started in 1966. It's important to understand that the Maoism that took place during the Cultural Revolution was a deviation from Marxism and Mao Zedong thought. It's important to note that the CPC officially recognizes the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution as mistakes, as deviations. They're not celebrating what happened here. So it's been an important task of the Communist Party to differentiate Mao Zedong thought from Maoism. So the Cultural Revolution was mainly led by the Gang of Four here. Mao was at the end of his life, and he really wasn't calling the shots. It was these guys who were in power. So some of the things that happened during the Cultural Revolution, there's the destruction of the Four Olds. They sent urban youth to live in the countryside. There was this campaign, criticize Lin Biao, criticize Confucius. And then one of the really important things one of the important mistakes that we'll talk about more is that during the Cultural Revolution, they overemphasized class struggle and they overemphasized centralization. And what happened was there was this breakdown in democratic centralism, where the rule of a person was prioritized over the rule of law. And so that's kind of embodied in this slogan, the two whatevers. So after the Cultural Revolution, some Maoists try to continue this legacy with this phrase, the two whatevers, which it's basically, it doesn't matter what the content is of what they're saying as long as Mao said it. So you can see how this is dogmatic. It's book worship. And this is really something that the Communist Party and Deng Xiaoping wanted to address. So during the Cultural Revolution, they believed that they could build socialism in poverty. New contradictions emerged, economic stagnation, there was a decrease in living standards, and some unrest started to occur. So Deng Xiaoping famously said, and this has been said a few times during this training school, Poverty is not socialism. To be rich is glorious. So Deng's restoration of Mao Zedong thought was mainly in response to what was happening in the Cultural Revolution. So in 1978, they launched the Reform and Opening Up. In the process of reform and opening up, the second generation of the collective leadership of the CPC, with Deng Xiaoping as the core, proposed and created the theory of building socialism with Chinese characteristics. Some other pillars of Deng Xiaoping's theory was liberating thought, seeking truth from facts, liberating the forces of production, and the primary stage of socialism. And we'll be talking about each one of these. Deng Xiaoping said, "We must integrate the universal truth of Marxism with the concrete realities of China, blaze a path of our own, and build socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is the basic conclusion we have reached after reviewing our long history." So liberating thought and seeking truth from facts. What were they liberating thought from? They were liberating thought from the dogmatism, the ossified thinking, and the book worship that was occurring during the Cultural Revolution. So here's some quotes that explain this. These are all from Deng Xiaoping. "To proceed from reality and seek truth from facts is our fundamental stand as materialists. Emancipating our minds means making our thinking conform to reality, making the subjective conform to the objective, and that means seeking truth from facts. When we want to be practical and realistic in all of our work, we must continue to emancipate our minds. Seeking truth from facts is the basis of the proletarian world outlook, as well as the ideological basis of Marxism. Just as in the past, we achieved all the victories in our revolution by following this principle, so today we must rely on it in our effort to accomplish the four modernizations, and that's to strengthen agriculture, industry, defense, science, and technology." So here there's a major shift in thinking within the Communist Party of China. They recognize a new theme within the bigger epoch of imperialism. So during the Mao period, the theme was war and revolution, and that was somewhat of a hangover from the Stalin period. And what Deng Xiaoping and the CPC recognized was peace and development was the new theme. So Mao overemphasized the inevitability of World War III, preparation for sudden large-scale nuclear war. Peace and development embodies China's new judgment of development in the current epoch. So some of the things that were going on during this period, there is the rise of the Third World, there is a nuclear arms race, and economic globalization. So it was not likely that a world war would break out. The Maoists emphasized class struggle, continuing the revolution through class struggle, whereas Deng Xiaoping emphasized liberating the forces of production. So Deng Xiaoping said here, "The important thing now is to waste no time in launching projects that should be launched. War is not going to break out, so there is no need to fear it and no problem of risk. We have been worried about the possibility of war and have had to be on the alert every year. I think we overdid it. I don't think there will be war for at least the next 10 years. So there is no risk. There was understood there was no risk of another world war. So China must waste no time in building the country rather than concentrating on preparation for war. The CPC stated that economic development is the greatest defense to safeguard world peace." So here's some key quotes to understand where they're coming from with the liberation of the forces of production. This is one of the most important quotes in all of Marxism, I would say. "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organizes the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible." So sometimes people will focus on rest by degree. That means social construction won't happen in one stroke. This is a process. And there's two components of socialism: centralizing the instruments of production, and more importantly, increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. The next quote here is by Lenin: "Communism is Soviet power plus electrification." And again, Deng Xiaoping: "The essence of socialism is the liberation and development of the productive forces, elimination of exploitation and polarization, and the ultimate achievement of prosperity for all." These 3 points are what Deng and the Communist Party called the three benefits. So in 1978, Deng Xiaoping did the reform and opening up. We need to understand that markets and planning do not define capitalism and socialism. In socialism, both exist to complement growth. So there's this quote by Deng Xiaoping: "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Or translation: "It doesn't matter if we use markets or planning, as long as we liberate the forces of production for common prosperity." Another quote that Deng Xiaoping says is, "Crossing the river by feeling the stones." Again, this goes back to the rest by degree. Socialism isn't accomplished in one stroke, so they want to take kind of baby steps. And so what they've done is they've trialed a lot of these reforms on a small scale, and they've expanded what's worked and gotten rid of what doesn't. We also need to understand universality versus particularity. So the market economy and state planning are universal features. They exist in capitalism, they've existed before capitalism, and they've existed after. These are just tools, methods, means, mechanisms to achieve social ends. And I put a little hammer to indicate these are tools. But they become distinct when they're given form by the overall socio-economic system. And the Chinese, they have words for this. So Taizi, Taizi is a word that they've used to describe institutional form. So that's the market economy or state planning. Whereas Sidhu is the overall socioeconomic system, and that would be feudalism, capitalism, socialism. So this is where they're getting at when they're talking about one country, two systems. They have socialism and capitalism within China, led by China. And this was embraced by Xi Jinping with his phrase, "going all the way." And he's going all the way with both markets and planning, also called deepening reform. So the socialist market economy during the Deng Xiaoping period took a basic role, and during the Xi Jinping era, it's taken a decisive role.
So you said that the things are like the tools that help with the reform and the opening up, like with the hammer?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you said it says one country, two systems, so it's not necessarily that capitalism is horribly bad, but it kind of plays in tandem with the institutional form. Is that kind of what it is?
Well, so they have two systems. So Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan are capitalists in their system, but they're all governed by China.
Oh, okay. I think that makes sense now. Okay.
So this is really important to understand, and it's probably basic dialectical materialism. I just didn't understand until I started studying China. So there's this idea of non-antagonistic contradictions. So Lenin famously said here that antagonism and contradiction are not all the same thing. Under socialism, the first will disappear and the second will remain. So contradictions will always exist, but antagonisms will wither away. So this is the idea of communism, really, is that ultimately in the higher phase of socialism, all of these contradictions will be made to be non-antagonistic. And so contradictions under a capitalist system are antagonistic. They lead to revolution. And this is the great mistake of the Cultural Revolution. They emphasize class struggle, which is antagonistic. And the way they should be thinking about class struggle is non-antagonistic. So that's been the focus of China to try to lower the antagonisms between the classes. So under socialism, contradictions should be managed to be non-antagonistic, especially contradictions among the people or class. So example of this is the bourgeoisie. So during feudalism, they were not yet antagonistic. And you could even say they were progressive. They were advocating liberty and democracy. But during capitalism, the bourgeoisie did become antagonistic. And this is the great class war between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But under socialism, that needs to change, where the bourgeoisie should again become non-antagonistic. So here's just a slide about human rights and describe the differences between how the Western liberal tradition views it versus the Chinese Marxist tradition. So at the roots of liberalism, their human rights comes from the individual mastery over private property. And this started during the slave period, during slavery. And you can see out of those roots come the trunk of civil and political rights. And now we're seeing the kind of crystallization of this as identity politics. The Marxist tradition is different. The basis of human rights for Marxists is sovereignty. It's anti-colonialism. And then, importantly, at the trunk here, we have the right to socio-economic well-being. This is so important. This is a human right that we don't recognize in the West. And then we have, at the very top, the civil, political, cultural, and environmental rights. So here is the base and the superstructure. So one of the key lessons I've taken from understanding this is that all of these institutional forms, such as markets, the state, planning, law, military, ideology, even dictatorship and democracy, these are all contained within the superstructure. And the superstructure is ultimately shaped by the economic base, the forces of production and the relations of production. So we need to understand that there is a difference in the form of the state, whether it's a capitalist state or a socialist state. And so another thing to understand here is that dictatorship and democracy are in a dialectic. So this is actually where the dictatorship of the proletariat sits. And it corresponds to socialist democracy. And that's different than if it were underneath the economic base of capitalism, where we have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and liberal democracy. They're different. So another key understanding that the Chinese communists put forward is this idea of the primary stage of socialism. So this demonstrates a key understanding of China's material conditions. Socialism emerged with a lot of baggage from the old capitalist society. So Marx says, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Hu Jintao said, China is still in the primary stage of socialism and will remain so for a long time to come. And then this quote by Marx, in a higher phase of communist society, after enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and there within also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed in its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. again by Marx. The realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity is left behind. So what he's getting at is there's two phases of socialism. There's a lower phase and a higher phase. But China understood not only is China in the lower phase, it's specifically in the primary stage of socialism. So the idea is that there are still inequality, gaps, and contradictions that still exist in this society. They're in the primary stage. After reform and opening up, new contradictions emerged. Unbalanced development, polarization, inequality, and corruption. Some of the state-owned enterprise were weakened, and there was a break between the Communist Party and the people, and a growing mistrust of the party. So this was a period of ideological confusion and heated debates within the Communist Party. And some of the most prominent factions within the Communist Party are listed here. So the most prominent was democratic socialism. And they realized that this only works for capitalism because it's part of the superstructure of capitalism. It still has antagonistic parties, private property, and bourgeois society. There's also some ultra-left Maoists that thought China was capitalist and wanted to roll back the reforms. There's some new left postmodernists, which reflected the decline of the West, promoted identity politics, and were historical nihilists, which means they kind of rejected actually existing socialism. And then we had some Western Marxists like Zizek, Harvey, and Wolff that confused the cyclical problems of reform with the systematic problems of socialism. And there is Neo-Confucius faction as well. So there's a lot going on, a lot of debate, a lot of confusion, but the conclusion here was that reform is an ongoing process of constantly emerging contradictions and resolving them. Reform and opening up was not temporary like the new economic policy in the USSR. It was a continuous process. G emphasized here that only socialism can save China. So looking at some of the mega projects of China, we can see that they've had some unprecedented growth since reform and opening up. On the left here is Shanghai. You can see there's nothing here basically, and now we have a full skyline. And Shenzhen was like farmland before. Now we have this massive city. So just unprecedented growth has taken place here.
City builders.
City builders. Yeah. This is the Three Gorges Dam, one of the largest structures in the world. Great accomplishment. High-speed rail. I mean, they have more high-speed trains than the rest of the world combined. We can see the transformation in just 2 decades here. This was really accelerated in 2016 under Xi Jinping. They announced the 8 verticals and the 8 horizontals. So I don't know if you can make it out here, but there's kind of 8 lanes of rail and 8 lanes going across. And as we saw yesterday, these are economic corridors. So it's not just a rail. There's economic development going 50 miles in each direction around these train stations. So you can see here, I kind of put the provinces in the back of the rail, and you can see some of the hot button issues like Tibet and Xinjiang have a lot of development going through these areas. So it's these regions are key to development. So under Xi Jinping, there's been some theoretical advancements in Marxism. In 2012, he put forward the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And 2 of the major components of this were represented in the 2 centenary goals. So in 2021, Shaokan society was the goal to make China a moderately prosperous society. And one of the major components of this was poverty reduction, which they accomplished in 2021. It was a great achievement. But moving forward, the goal by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China, they want to build a strong, socialistically modernized country. Another theoretical contribution of Xi Jinping is around the idea of democratic centralism. So prior to Xi Jinping, democratic centralism was primarily focus on the party. But Xi Jinping extended this idea to the entire country of China. So this is why his book is called Governance of China. It's the idea of kind of spreading these ideas throughout the whole country. There's the Tigers and Flies anti-corruption campaign, and they've already had over 100,000 cases. So just think about that anti-corruption campaign. Imagine that happening here in the US. It's kind of unthinkable. Something we probably need. And then 2013 Belt and Road Initiative, which I'll be talking about a little bit more. In 2015, the Communist Party put forward this 10-year plan that aims to turn China into a high-end manufacturer. They wanted to move away from labor-intensive factory work to become a technology-intensive powerhouse. The idea was to help achieve independence from foreign suppliers. And one of the key components of this is the semiconductor industry. China hopes to take the lead in the fourth industrial revolution, and they've taken a lot of inspiration from Germany's Industry 4.0. I put some of the key industries kind of on here: artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, machine learning, robotics, green energy. But what we really should focus on here is superconductors. This is going to be pretty important. So superconductors are used in everything from our iPhones to fighter jets. And right now, the world leader who's kind of taken off has been Taiwan. There's a company, the TSMC, and basically all tech companies, if they want the best superconductors, they have to go to Taiwan. So this is the reason why there's so much talk about Taiwan today. Because both the US and China right now, their technology sectors are dependent on Taiwan. But this is changing. China's trying to create something that can compete or outcompete. But this is the reason why Trump did the tariffs. He wanted to undermine this plan of China becoming a high-end manufacturer. And it's literally the conflict right now with Biden and the United States. Like, they literally want to go to World War III over superconductors. So this is a space we need to be watching very closely. Some other exciting projects going on in China. So there's kind of these 3 mega cities that have sprung up in China. Around Beijing, there's 100 million people. Around the Yangtze River, the Shanghai region, 150 million people. And the Pearl River Delta is like Hong Kong and Macau and Shenzhen. What they're doing is they're really trying to make these regions more integrated. So you can see here, this is the Jingzhenji. This is what they're calling the new city, and it's Beijing, Tianjin, and another city. They're kind of connecting all 3 of these cities and making one big mega city. And then one of the other ideas here is that they're moving the capital to a new region. Not the entire capital, just kind of the administrative functions of the capital. They're moving it to a rural area. And so the idea is they're closing the gap between the rural and the urban that Marx talked about. And this, as you can see, this is kind of the goal for this region, the new capital. It's like this rural paradise, basically. It's pretty cool. Here's another big project that was just completed in 2018, the Hong Kong Zhuhai Macau Bridge. It's the longest bridge in the world over water. It spans 34 miles over the Pearl Delta region, connecting Hong Kong to Macau. And you can see here, what engineers have called this is the Mount Everest of bridges. So it's a modern marvel. And you can see here there's these 2 artificial islands that they've created to allow cargo ships to pass through. So it's a pretty remarkable project. And this is the Great Green Wall of China. So like Gaddafi's great man-made river. China's literally turning the Gobi Desert, they're literally greening the Gobi Desert, the fifth largest desert in the world. So if you can see here what they're doing, they're creating these straw checkerboards. And what that does, it prevents the dunes from shifting in the wind, which allows topsoil to develop on top of the dunes. And then they can plant trees. And as we saw yesterday, greening the desert is one of the biggest answers to the rising CO2 levels. So this is a pretty remarkable project. We could see a green Gobi Desert in a few decades. And fusion energy is really taking off in China. This is the artificial sun project, which is on the verge of unlocking the potential of fusion energy, which is arguably the holy grail of physics. Could mean unlimited energy. This is the technological foundation for a post-scarcity society. It would really transform the way humans interact with our environment. So there are really two models of globalism that have emerged in the world today. Since the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods system and the Washington Consensus has been set up, basically dominated by the US dollar. And this is an imperialist system. It's based on this zero-sum game. The deals are based on plunder. The West is constantly interfering in the internal affairs of other sovereign states under the pretext of human rights and democracy. Ultimately, this model is keeping other countries poor so they can stay rich. But there's an alternative. In China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, deals are based on mutual benefit, win-win cooperation to help the country's economy. And China isn't just helping developing countries financially, but they have the technological and historical expertise in development. Another aspect of this is if countries default on their loans, one of the problems is that the West has these conditional requirements, so they're gonna force these countries to implement privatization of their industries and implement austerity measures, whereas the China bank isn't really asking for those kind of economic reforms.
The AIIB?
Yes. So what's really nice in China is they have the state-issued credit. They have the China Development Bank and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the Belt and Road is mainly funded and credited by this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But when countries can't pay, and when they don't have the means to get into this, the China Development Bank will step in and they'll put the financial risk on the state-owned enterprises, not the state directly. So the financial risk is placed on the state bank. So the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. This is a massive multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure development project. So they're building ports, power stations, rail lines, roads, and all the tunnels and bridges needed to connect them with the mainland. There's two main components of the Belt and Road Initiative. We have the land-based Silk Road Economic Belt, and then we have a sea-based Maritime Silk Road. And it's important to note that this Maritime Silk Road is a direct threat to the Atlanticist model, the British, the US Navy, and power over the trade routes that they have long had control over. And the part of the land-based portion of the Belt and Road, there's these 6 major economic corridors. Some of the important ones, the new Eurasian land bridge and the China-Pakistan corridor. So these land corridors also make up part of the World Land Bridge. A lot of the World Land Bridge is already complete, and it's because of the Belt and Road Initiative. So since 2013, already 147 countries have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Maybe the US should think about this. Most of the world is already on board with China in doing this. And here are just a few of the projects that I think are cool. Africa's first transnational electric railway in Ethiopia. It's a 466-mile railway, and it's really making Ethiopia become a sovereign nation by having this. There's a railway that goes from China into Laos, so they're connecting close by countries. And this is kind of cool. There's this bridge that goes in Kenya that's elevated to allow giraffes to go underneath the bridge. So they're kind of conscious of local environments. China versus the U.S. in dealing with the debt crisis. So not everything is perfect in China. In 2021, China faced a similar housing bubble that the U.S. had in 2008. In 2020, the real estate was already about 20% of the GDP. So there's a pretty big bubble that took place. In 2008, the U.S. solution was too big to fail. There was a big government bailout that ensured the private sector. The West followed with a lot of money printing, which accumulated in the largest transfer of wealth upwards in human history. And who paid the cost? It was regular working class people. In China, they had a different approach. In 2021, the Evergrande, a giant speculative real estate corporation, defaulted on their debt payments. Xi Jinping had a different approach. They did a debt restructuring process, and they forced the founders of this company to sell off some of their personal assets. Regular investors or average people, they got the bailout, whereas the speculators, they paid the debt. And the Communist Party started taking over ownership of some of these companies. So although there was a slowdown in the real estate growth, there was no upward transfer of wealth that took place in the West. And the views of China have changed recently. What was understood, what the West is starting to understand is that shock therapy didn't happen in China like what happened in the USSR. Capitalism was never restored. There was no privatization efforts. Neoliberalism did make inroads, deregulating labor market and healthcare, but it didn't become a dominant thing. So even many Western economists no longer think China is capitalist. So their view is changing. And just want to point here to Xi Jinping's policy of common prosperity. So in reforming the contradictions that have arisen, they've put forward this idea of common prosperity. So Xi Jinping has emphasized this as an essential requirement of socialism, that everybody benefits from what's happening in the development. And so here's just a few examples of why China is not capitalist. So China employs a market sector that is dominated by the Communist Party. Thus, it cannot be argued that even now, much of employment and investment is still undertaken by publicly owned companies or by institutions that are under the direction and control of the Communist Party. The biggest part of China's world-beating industry is not foreign-owned multinationals, but Chinese state-owned enterprises. Think of Huawei. The major banks are state-owned, and their lending and deposit policies are directed by the government, much to the chagrin of China's central bank and other pro-capitalist elements. There is no free flow of foreign capital into and out of China. Capital controls are imposed and enforced, and the currency's value is fixed in a narrow band. Additionally, every company that operates within China must submit a social responsibility report that demonstrating that they're not only achieving profit but they're also achieving social ends. And just a note, China hasn't been in a war since 1979. So there's been a big shift in oil recently with all the development going on in China. And China has now become the world leader in oil imports. And this is creating some buzz. So the Petroyuan is emerged, which means that oil is priced in the yuan instead of dollars. And this is a big threat to the petrodollar. And there's talk that possibly Saudi Arabia might transition from selling their oil in the US dollar to the Chinese yuan. And this just kind of points to China's foreign policy, how they engage with countries. They don't engage them on an ideological level. They engage them on a win-win cooperation. So, like, they work with governments we might not like, but their goal is focus on economic development, win-win. So this gets to what's been going on recently. A lot of changes have happened, and in February 2022, 20 days before the Ukraine situation, China and Russia issued a joint statement on a new multipolar era. Some things that were emphasized in this statement: that they oppose NATO expansion, they emphasize multipolarity, they talked about Taiwan and how the West is using democracy as a pretext for wars. And right here, it was emphasized that the friendship between these countries has no limits. This isn't just an alliance, this is stronger than an alliance. One other thing I would just like to emphasize that this is a big change from the Cold War, where the Sino-Soviet split these countries, these two major Eurasian powers. But today in the 21st century, they're aligned. And so this is a big change, and it's something that is going to be changing the future looking forward. So the West, in response to the Ukraine, has put sanctions on Russia. And one of the major aspects of that was kicking them off the SWIFT system, which is a major component of global trade. And this is it's kind of backfired on the United States strategy, and it's actually pushed China and Russia closer together. So China's been forced to seek alternatives, which we have here. The CIPS is the China alternative to SWIFT, which was kind of nothing before this conflict happened. But now with China joining, with Russia joining, there's kind of a shift in what's going on here. So just recently in March 2022, there was this statement here that the Shanghai Cooperative Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union would work in stronger cooperation. And so there's some thought that maybe there's a merger, but what's important is that Russia and China are working much closer together, and there's other countries that are aligning with this bloc. So here's just an idea that Haas from Infrared has put forward that I think is kind of interesting to think about. In this new Eurasian model, there's kind of two civilizations that make up the base and the superstructure. So the base, China is expressing the economic base with its Belt and Road and economic development, where Russia is expressing the superstructure with its politics and military. And this age of multipolarity is inevitable. And really what that means is that, I kind of put these three things here. So as countries are breaking out of the domination of imperialism, as you saw in Ethiopia, they're developing that rail line. They're becoming sovereign and independent from foreign powers. One great example of this is the BRICS. And so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and just recently, I think Argentina is thinking about joining this. But there is a new emerging alternative to the U.S. being the sole pole in the world. And with this, there's been some opposition. So there's kind of this Cold War 2.0 that's emerging. We see that Blinken has called China the most serious long-term threat to world order. Soros calls China's Xi Jinping the greatest threat that open societies face today. And Biden here, it said he would defend Taiwan if attacked by China.
Taiwan is China.
Yeah, Taiwan is China. So this is pretty scary. Like, the U.S. has been talking of decoupling from China, which would lead to World War III. Like, China doesn't want this. China wants to work with the United States, wants to do win-win cooperation. So I think it's something we should be thinking about. And the Secretary of Defense has also positioned himself in this Cold War with these statements. So it's kind of scary what's going on. And then I just want to end here with this thing called the Quad. So it's this alliance between India, the United States, Australia, and Japan. And really what this is, they're trying to combat the Belt and Road Initiative and China's development. And they're trying to build this military alliance. Another component of this is the Indo-Pacific strategy that Biden released, which includes other countries like Indonesia, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, and even Vietnam. So we have some questions here, like not sure where some of these countries will lean. And this is Xi Jinping at the centenary in 2021. I love this part in the speech. It's really cool that this happened. I would recommend you all checking out his speech from that. But in summary, the superiority of socialism is on full display in China for the world to see. It's smoking gun proof that socialism works. The West can only cope for so long. It's getting harder to ignore or deny the achievements in economic development. China's unprecedented economic development is increasingly exposing the contradictions here in the West. There's about 95% confidence in China in the Communist Party. The Chinese are hopeful, and they're striving towards a vision of the future. Just compare that to Biden and his approval ratings. The future of humanity is marching forward in China, whether you like it or not. And this gives me a lot of optimism and hope. And I think that every country today is ultimately defined by their geopolitical position towards China, whether for or against. It's almost the only question you need to ask when thinking about other countries and where they stand. And then I'll just end here with some references or recommendations. So these are some of the books that I drew from in creating this. The main one here that I would recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about this is Roland Bohr's Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. And this guy, he's an Australian, but he's worked and taught in China for decades. And he really specifically addresses many of the liberal conceptions of China. So it's written from a Western perspective and explains very eloquently, probably better than me, some of these concepts. Also, Jin Hui Ming, he's an academician of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. So he's a doctorate supervisor of the Academy of Marxism. Another very good book. And these are both big textbooks that have a lot of information. Another resource I drew from was John Ross, The Great Road to China. That's where I got a lot of the economic data from. And this guy is a British Keynesian. He's like a sympathetic Trotskyist, but he's very pro-China and someone we should draw from. And this last book I actually didn't read. This was recommended by Chris Morlock, who helped me with some of my slides. He's one of the members in CPI California who's very well-read on this topic. But he would recommend this book by Isabella Weber, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. So, That's all I have today. Thank you. Any questions?
When you say with the Petroyuan, and then you use the term that are now China, and because of now having Russia and then possibly the Saudi, to deal with this currency, and you say price in change rather than like saying the word like, oh, it's going to be paid on the. So what's the difference between say that is price versus saying that is that they're going to pay it in that currency? Is there any difference, or it's just semantic?
Well, the main thing is that because China is importing the most oil in the world, they're kind of able to set the tone with global trade, and they're able to price their oil in terms of the yuan. So it's going to make countries are going to have to exchange their currency in yuan now instead of dollars in order to buy oil.
So when you're talking about the way they're doing the state issued credit and the way they do it for countries that can't pay it back, I'm wondering, that if you saw like a bunch of propaganda about China taking over this, I wish I could remember which country it was, but it was an African country, taking over their airport. Was it Ethiopia? That China taking over Ethiopia's airport. Did you see the stories about that and how that was being pushed? And is that an example of like how they're using the state issued credit and like, are you familiar with those stories?
What I can say is that China they have mechanisms for countries that don't have a lot of economic prosperity, and so they're able to shift the risk onto their own state-owned enterprises instead of putting all the financial risk on those countries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Awesome presentation.
Okay, I don't know if you can answer this, and I've been questioning it too, but how would you explain India two-siding this issue? Like being a part of the Quad and then also being a part of the BRICS, like, is it like a conflict within India, obviously? That's like, so that's, yeah, that's...
I think that's a big question. I mean, there's probably divisions within the ruling class in India, I would think, and some parts are more aligned with China and some are more aligned with the West. And
is there any, like, do you see India dropping out of the Quad at all, or do you think they'll continue being a part of the West also, while trying to also be friendly with China and Russia? Like, what do you, I don't know. I've been observing, but I just don't know how to...
I'm not really sure. I don't think we know yet, but it seems like India has been more favorable to Russia and maybe a little bit more antagonistic to China, and maybe they were kind of forced into that position because they were friendly with Russia.
Right.
And we've seen shifts in Brazil. I mean, Lula da Silva was fundamental in starting BRICS, but when he was kind of kicked out and Bolsonaro took over, BRICS has kind of been on the back burner. But there's an election coming up and Lula da Silva might get reelected, and so BRICS is kind of potentially going to come back on the stage as a major force in this.
Okay. That was my question.
Would you allow me to elaborate a little bit on the India part?
Oh, yeah.
I came from India, and I learned from them rather than from Wikipedia and Google. In light of something that many of you guys in these 4 days have been presenting, and in the online shows Kali has said, it's not like we're going to say that China is perfect and Russia in its posture against NATO is perfect. No such thing. We're not going to idolize nobody. It's just we recognize that there's certain part of the global or the current system that are doing less harm and that are going the right direction. So in terms of India, is very unfair and oversimplified. We say, that it has tend to be more the United States and many things, because certain ruling class in India. One thing that is important in India is that there's certain conflict, territorial conflict between North of India with China, in which many people of both sides get affected, and these are indigenous people of India that has been affected. China is a mighty, mighty economic power, but also a mighty army power compared to India. And because of that, last year, there was a crossing of border situations. Bullets went from one side to the other side, and obviously, China is the biggest fish. It's a reality. We cannot hide it. We cannot deny it. It wouldn't be unfair to both sides of it. These are two highly intelligent, highly advanced states and ancient people, both of them 5,000 years, each one of them ahead of us. So it's something that they have to solve. It's not for NATO, the United States, the United Nations, the Red Cross, the Pope to interfere and decide who's good. No, exactly. These states will solve, and they're doing very well, especially with Gandhi, what's his name, the Prime Minister of India? Modi, the way he's be turning, not opening against the current administration of the United States. He's too part of the Quad, that you say, because it needs to be. It needs to be. In order for China, as a highly advanced, highly intellectual state, to respect India, India has to have a foot here and a foot there. So it is through Russia, it is getting closer to China behind doors, but it's coming obvious. But also it has to have a foot with the Quads, because it's just like you guys are ahead of us, you're stronger than us, military, economic wise, and we are border to border. It's we that deal with you. The rest of the world don't deal with you, China. That's the position of Modi and his people. People, not ruling class, people, especially indigenous tribal people in India. So that's why it's good to travel and listen to speak to the people, not only to the college, the scholar, and blah, blah, blah. So therefore, it's not a big deal. They're going to work it out just fine.
I just want to comment that like the rise of China is especially inspiring right now, because you see this widespread confidence in the quote non-Western world. Like, yeah, if you go to Nicaragua, for example, you ask the people, like, who's the leader of the world, China or the U.S.? Vast majority are going to say the U.S. I mean, not the U.S., China. Yeah, no. The era of U.S. domination over the world is ending. And even people within the West, we know this. Does like any normal American feel confident about the direction that we're going in? No, of course not. And you also see this, like, I think COVID really exacerbated this. And you also, it's kind of funny, you see that here in the West, our vaccines, they're just named after like boring ass pharmaceutical companies, like hashtag Team Pfizer. Got my Fauci ouchie. Ugh. But then you look at the vaccines that have been developed by Cuba and Russia. You look at their names. With Russia, they have Sputnik, which it shows like this great technological advancement from Russia. Like, they're the ones who actually won the space race. Like, if you look at all the achievements, Russia comes out on top, except for landing on the moon first. It's the only one. And you look at Cuba, you look at their COVID vaccines, Soberana, Abdallah, I think there are some others, but like Soberana, that means sovereign. And Abdallah, that's like, it's from a poem from Jose Marti, I believe, about Cuban independence and everything. So just the names of the vaccines alone kind of show this sense of confidence, of sovereignty, of knowing that Western domination is on the decline.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the COVID crisis really highlights the differences between these two economic systems. Like, this total failure in the COVID response here in the West. So many people have died, and it's not fair. We deserve better. We deserve a socialist system that puts people first, and I think that was really highlighted in China and countries like Vietnam and other socialist countries.
That's why I tweeted out a few months ago that Xi Jinping is the leader of the free world.
Absolutely.
And so think about with the COVID, not only that people die, but people reputation, profession, career has been destroyed, have been persecuted, has been cancelled, that it goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
I was just curious, Biden said he would defend Taiwan if it was attacked by China, and I'm wondering if China will defend Hawaii if it's attacked by the United States. I just hope this goes both ways. So, no, but I just wanted to make a comment. First of all, excellent presentation. I want to get a copy of it, man. There's like people are hungry for this because you see stuff like that Harvard study where they're like 90% of the citizens in China approve of the government, and Americans just don't believe it because they see everything through our state, which is not for us. It's for 1,000 people at the top of society,
Exactly.
But when Russia and China put out that, Friendship Without Borders, is that what it was about? The speech that there's no Sino-Soviet split this time, folks. We're together. And in my head, I thought, with the CPI, maybe we can extend that Friendship Without Borders just to one other nation, the one where I live, called America. And then we can all live in peace together and achieve a global common prosperity, and we can all get rich, because to get rich is glorious.
Yeah, the United States should be working with China, not competing with them.
Absolutely.
Cooperation.
And I think the average American citizen would be for that if they could see how they would financially benefit and how it would help their sons and daughters not die in a stupid war.
Not to mention, even a lot of MAGA people are acknowledging that Xi Jinping is fighting the deep state.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I saw that on YouTube.
Not really a question, but I mean a comment along the lines of what he said. I really appreciate this because, I have friends that side with us on a lot of things, but they either usually implicitly, go against China or anti-China, and so this kind of information is really helpful because there's a lot of questions they ask that I can't particularly answer. So thank you very much for this. I've enjoyed all the lectures, but this one in particular because it's been an issue of contention with some people I know in my life. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.